Last week we were studying about these four underlying principles that help to explain why there is suffering in the world. And I believe that most of the suffering that we experience will be found in one of these principles. There may be one or two others that you might think of, but I think most of our suffering would fall under one of these categories. We talked about the regularity of the law, the fact that God made laws to govern this world, and sometimes when those laws are violated, people suffer. Sometimes these laws work together to produce a hurricane or a tornado or something along that line, and suffering comes. But oftentimes it's because man has violated some of these laws. For example, we talked about the fact that floods come sometime. When rain comes, God's design was for it to sink into the ground, soak up in the ground. But man has built roads and driveways and sidewalks and foundations for houses all over the world, and when it rains, the rain can't get into the soil. It runs off into sewages and drain pipes and this and that and into rivers, and because all of that flows into the rivers, it sometimes overflows. Now, we can't blame God with that when man has done that. And that's true with some of these laws that bring suffering to us. We violate those laws. And then there's the freedom of man's will. God gave man the right to decide what he's going to do, and sometimes man chooses the wrong thing, and as a result, he suffers. And there is the value of imperfect conditions. We were talking about this point as we concluded last week, and I want to hit it again and again because I think it is vitally important for us to remember that there are values in suffering. Now, sometimes it's difficult for us to understand that and accept that, but it is true, there is value in imperfect conditions. Now, suffering has a way of building good character in us and bringing forth in us certain principles that will help us to be ready for heaven. So sometimes suffering is good along that line. It helps us to get ready for heaven. Harold Hazlitt, in his book, Anchors for the Asking, had this to say along that line. Experience confirms that we can grow through suffering. People who remain faithful under trial do not merely survive, they deepen and broaden their lives. In 1973, Orville Kelly learned that he had inoperable cancer. He responded by forming a club. He called it MTC, and that stands for Make Today Count. He lived an additional 10 years then, and before he died in 1982, Kelly lived an additional 10 years, and before he died, he said, if I had to choose between life without cancer and life with cancer, with all the lessons that I have learned, I would choose the life with cancer. He was a man who had grown through his suffering. He had learned to accept it and live with it, and he had learned some things from it that helped him to live a better life. So he established that club, MTC, meaning Make Today Count. And so it is certainly true that suffering can be good for us if we have the right attitude toward it and use it properly. We often ask the question, why? Why did this happen? Why does it happen? When the question ought to be, how? How can we use it? How can we grow from this experience? How can we deal with it? And so the better question is how, not why. But we usually ask why. Now, I believe it was Joe Barnett who told this story. He told about a man back during the Depression. Most of you haven't known what that's all about, but back some time ago there was a big depression. And there was a man who lost his job, and he used up all of his savings, and he lost his house because he didn't have a job to make any money and pay for that house. And then to top it off, his precious wife died. He was out wandering around one day looking for work because jobs were very scarce then. And he came upon some men who were building a church building. And he saw that they were shaping rocks to put on the front, like our building. You look at the front of ours, we've got a number of rocks up there for decoration. And he saw one man who was shaping a rock to be in the shape of a triangle. And he didn't see where it would fit. So he said to this man, "Where are you going to put that rock?" That man pointed up to the top and said, "You see up there near the spire, see that vacant place? That's where this rock will go. I'm shaping it down here so it will fit up there." And as that man left, he had tears in his eyes as he thought about his suffering, his situation, and he thought, this must be why I'm suffering. God is shaping me down here so I will fit up there. Now that's a good thought. The suffering that we are enduring here may be getting us prepared for heaven after a while. And so there are blessings to be found in suffering. You know, you can go to the doctor. You might have heart trouble. He might put you into the hospital and cut you open, split this sternum apart and pry the ribs apart and take your heart out and put some new parts in there, sew you back up, and after you wake up, you may be in great pain. And for a while, you may have pain. Talk to Paul Clements about that. He's gone through that twice. There's a lot of suffering involved at a time like that. But after a while, he'll get better, and his life will be extended, you see. Sometimes suffering is good for us. It may be that the suffering will help us get better. That can be true physically. It can be true spiritually as well. Sometimes suffering helps us. Doesn't the Bible teach in Hebrews 12, verse 6 following? For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he redeemeth. Isn't it true that God is teaching in the context that discipline sometimes is good? It helps us get going in the right direction. When I was young, my father used one of these straight razors to shave with. Had a long blade about like that. Some of you know about that. He didn't know anything about an electric razor back then. And that thing looked very dangerous. You could slip and cut your throat with that thing. And he had a razor strap about that long, and he sharpened that razor on that razor strap. That thing was about 3.5 inches wide and about that long, and there was a second part to it as well. But my daddy learned that there's another use for that thing. When I misbehaved when I was young, he wouldn't say, "Go out and get me a switch." He got that razor strap. And that thing contributed to my education. Now, back then I needed it quite often. I could have put a sign above that thing and said, "I need thee every hour." I probably did. But it must have done some good. I must have learned the lesson, because as I got a little older, I didn't get that thing. I don't remember my daddy whipping me with that thing when I got a little older. I must have learned the lesson well. But you see, that discipline was good. And you went through some of that yourself, no doubt. The discipline helped point your feet in the right direction. That's why God uses discipline. Sometimes suffering can be used by God as discipline to point us in the right direction. And so we need to remember that there are values in suffering, and not ask God to take away all of our suffering. We might take away some possibilities of growing, becoming more like we ought to be, and that might contribute to our salvation. So, drive a peg down right there, and we'll come back to that. I want to really emphasize this matter of the blessings that are to be found in suffering. The fourth underlying principle is the interdependence of human life. In Romans chapter 14, verse 7, you remember that Paul said, "For none of us liveth to himself, and no man dieth to himself." What does that mean? None of us liveth to himself, and no man dieth to himself. Doesn't that mean that our lives touch each other? We can influence each other. And that's certainly true, for good or bad. And sometimes other people cause us to suffer because of our interdependence of human life. People can rob us, can murder us, or hurt us in some other way. We can suffer because our lives touch the lives of other people. Some years ago, I was preaching in Atlanta, and I decided to leave there after a number of years, and we moved to Mobile. And just before we moved to Mobile to preach for the Pleasant Valley Church, a member of the church there was killed. God's people, good people, sometimes can suffer in this way. This man, I believe, went to Alabama Christian College. Some of you may have known him. Eddie Nasser was his name. And from all accounts that I heard, he was a good man, did a lot of preaching, and was a good person. He was running a store, and he had his little children with him in the store that day. His wife had to run some errands, and he was taking care of them. And two thugs went into that store and robbed him and shot him to death, right there in the presence of his children. Fortunately, later, those two thugs were caught out in Little Rock, Arkansas. They were brought back to Alabama, tried and convicted of murder, and were sentenced to death. And I remember I was flying in an airplane over the Pacific down to New Zealand for a campaign, and the captain came on the radio and announced that one of those men had just been electrocuted in the state of Alabama, and the other was put to death on another occasion. Fortunately for mankind, those two people were removed. But there was a good man who suffered because of someone else mistreating them. You think about that for a moment now. Would you want to live in a place where you wouldn't have a possibility of suffering because of other people? Well, when you think about it, I doubt that you'd want to do that. It should be remembered that our associations with other people bring some of the greatest blessings and joys that we know. And if God took away that possibility of someone else hurting you, it would also take away the possibility of you enjoying those blessings with other people, you see. So we would not want God to remove this possibility of being with other people, because we could suffer if they were there. We also have the possibility of being blessed. If we didn't have that possibility, then think of all the joys and all the blessings that you enjoy with your family, your wife, your husband, your children or grandchildren, and all of that would be gone if you didn't have that association with other people. Without this association with others, life without association with other people would be barren, and really it'd be meaningless if you didn't have that opportunity to be with other people. So, one of the reasons that people suffer is the fact that we associate with other people. They can hurt us. Now, to avoid this, we would have to live on some deserted island where no one else is around, and you couldn't do that. There wouldn't be enough islands. There are over 7 billion people on earth. Or God would have to put you into an airtight compartment. No one could get to you. You couldn't get to anyone else. And you wouldn't have a cell phone, and some people never would make it if they didn't have a cell phone with them. If you were in an airtight compartment, no one else could hurt you. You couldn't have a phone because they can hurt you with the phone. I've had that. Probably you have too. So you see, God would have to put you in some sort of situation in which no one else could touch you, say anything, or hurt you in any way. The avoidance of all contact with other human beings might save us some suffering. But think of what it would cost us, as we mentioned a moment ago. Your association with your wife, husband, children, or grandchildren, you wouldn't have all of that if you did not have that association. And so, while we have that suffering because we associate with other people, we wouldn't want to give that up. We would not want God to put us into some airtight compartment where we'd have no association with anyone else. Now, I should like to say something just here that might cause some of you to bite a hole in your chewing gum. I'd like to say that God is limited. There are some things that God can't do. Now hold on to that. We'll talk about that. God limits himself. There is but one God. There is no other God who could place God under any limitation. No man could place God under any limitation. If there are limitations, it's those God places upon himself. God has limited himself in some ways. Now, I want us to think about that a few minutes and make an application of it. God limits himself. Can God make a round triangle? Think about that. Can God make a round triangle? That's something he can't do, you see. It's impossible within itself. If it's round, it's no longer a triangle. Some kids would say, God cannot make a mountain that he can't climb. Well, that'd be true, wouldn't it? If he can make it, he can climb it. God cannot dig a hole that he cannot fill. That's true. There are some limitations, you see. And God limits himself when it is in harmony with his will and his way. Now, think about this. Does the Bible teach that there is anything that's impossible for God? It does it not? In Hebrews 6 and verse 18, the Bible tells us that it is impossible for God to lie. God cannot lie. And I know when I said a while ago God is limited, you might have said, now, doesn't the Bible say that with men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible? All things that are in harmony with God's will are possible. It is not in harmony with God's will for him to lie. It's not in harmony with his character. Is it possible for God to be tempted? The Bible says it isn't. James 1:13, for God cannot be tempted with evil. There's another impossibility. Can God tempt people to sin? Can God try to persuade people to sin? Same verse tells us, neither can he tempt any man. God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. Can God accept evil? Can he countenance evil? Accept it, live with it? The Bible says he cannot. In Habakkuk 1 and verse 13, the Bible tells us that God cannot countenance evil. So you see, there are some impossibilities because they're contrary to God's will and God's nature. So God does limit himself in some way. And I'd like for you to think of it in terms of these things we've been talking about. Now, if God should take away the regularity of the law, he would also take away the possibility of man living here on earth. We couldn't live here without those laws. So God cannot allow us to have all these blessings if he takes away these laws that govern the world. There is freedom in man's will. Man has the ability to choose. And if God took away that freedom, it would take away the possibility that man chooses to do evil and bring suffering. But it would also take away his ability to do good and right and be blessed. So you see, God cannot allow man to enjoy this world and all of its freedoms and the ability to make choices if he takes away that ability. If he takes away the ability to do evil, he takes away the ability to do good and right. And so God limits himself in that regard. There's the value of imperfect conditions. Now, sometimes we'd like for God to remove all the suffering that's in the world. But if he does that, he would also remove the possibility of those sufferings to prepare you for heaven. You'd miss some of that teaching and training that suffering gives you, and you might not be fit for heaven. And so God limits himself. He can't take away the possibility of all of these sufferings on earth while at the same time allowing you to be free of suffering and missing some of that training that would prepare you for heaven. And then number 4, there's the interdependence of human life. If God removed the suffering that comes to us because of our contact with other people, He would also remove the blessings that come from our associations with other people. Do you see that? God is limited. He can't do some things that are contrary to His will and contrary to His nature. And so I said a while ago that God is limited. God limits Himself. No one else can do it. There is no other God who can do it. But God can limit Himself. Now, the Bible teaches that though God cannot take away all of His suffering while at the same time giving us the blessings that are involved here on earth, He does promise that if we love Him and serve Him, then He will bless us and make all things work together for good. In Romans 8:28, Paul said, "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to His purpose." Now I believe that. I believe God is able to take all these things that happen to us and make them work together for our good. That doesn't say that all things are good. They're not. But they work together for good with God's help. I would not want to eat just the flour in a cake. Don't think it'd be too good by itself. I would not want to eat just the sugar that goes into a cake. I would not want to eat just the flavoring that goes into that cake. But those of you who can cook and blend those things together make something that is good, a cake. Some of the things that happen to us on earth are not good, but God can make them work together for our good. I've seen that in my life. I've seen, I believe, the providence of God. Now, there are things that I believe are the providence of God, but I couldn't prove it. I couldn't prove it to save my life, but I believe it. By faith, I accept the fact that God's providence works. When I was a student at Harding, I received a call from home down in Central Florida telling me that my mother had undergone surgery and there were complications and that I needed to come home immediately. And you know what that means. Now, I was in the middle of a semester and it would be difficult to leave school, but I had to do it. Mackie and I were married then. I went to school here 2 years and then went to Harding 2 years, and Mackie and I were married when we went out there. And she got a PhD degree. That means put hubby through. So we were in school there, and we left to drive to Florida. There were no interstates then. Fastest speed you could go was 55. And it would take 18 hours and more to drive home. We didn't have any money to stay at a motel on the way, so we had to drive straight through. I remember I had to stick my head out of the car to let the wind blow in my face and keep me awake to go. But we finally arrived down there, and my mother was in the hospital with a fever of 107. And I asked the doctor, what are the possibilities? I said, if you can't get this fever down, doesn't that mean there won't be any hope? He said, that's correct. And she died. We had a funeral down there. I went back to school. But I remember this passage that sustained me through that time. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to His purpose. And I believe that God sustained me and providentially make things work out for good. I had a teacher out at Harding who said, if you're taking notes and you drop your pencil one time, pick it up and keep going. If you drop your pencil twice, pick it up next semester. That's how fast they were going and how difficult it was. But the teachers there enabled me, gave me permission to make up the time that I had lost and the work that I had missed. And everything worked out well. And I made better grades there at Harding than I did at Alabama Christian College. I believe that God's providence was involved in that, in sustaining me and making everything work together for good. And I believe that God will do that with us. When it comes to temptation, the Bible says in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13, there hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you're able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it. So when we suffer from temptation, we have the promise of God's help. In all of our suffering, we have the promise of God's help. So when I say God is limited, He's limited by His will and His way. No one else can limit God in any way. But that brings me back to this question. Is pain harmful or helpful to us? Would you like for God to remove all pain? I don't think any of us would want God to remove all pain if we think about it. W.D. Hamilton was the son-in-law of Brother Gus Nichols. He wrote 2 books on this matter of human suffering. One of them was written when he was dying. He knew he was dying, he had but a limited time, and he was trying to get through that writing before he died. He told a story, or recorded a story that he had read from a sermon, a lecture that was made by Tryon Starnes at ACC Lectures 1969. He said, in Pembury, Kent, England, there is a boy who cannot feel pain. His malady is termed by medical science as ganglioneuropathy. And that means that something is wrong with the ganglia, or the nerve centers, which transmit the sensation of pain to the brain. As a little boy, he was scarred from head to feet from injuries he never felt. At the age of 9 months, he almost completely gouged out one of his eyes, yet felt no pain at all. Physicians were amazed to discover he needed no anesthetic. When they operated on him, they didn't have to put him to sleep because he felt no pain. When he was 2, he was found kneeling on the open door of a hot electric oven with his hand and knee cooking, yet he felt no pain. At 2 years old, he pulled open the door of that oven, and it had become very hot, and he just climbed up on top of the door and was burning his hand and his feet, and yet he felt no pain. The final sentence in the feature article telling the story stated that the boy's father realized that life has played a cruel trick on his son by denying him the gift of pain. Never before had I realized what a precious gift pain is. Thank God, as normal human beings, we can feel pain. Of course, knowing this does not make pain pleasant. Pain is somewhat of a paradox, a seeming contradiction. It makes us miserable, yet we're thankful for it. We don't like it, but it serves a purpose. We want to get rid of it, yet we want it when we need it. We fight it, yet thank God for it. You see, pain is good. I would not pray that God will remove all pain. We need that pain. Sometimes it warns us and lets us know that there is a problem. How many people have you known who were intimately acquainted with pain, and yet who had a good spirit and attitude toward it, and therefore were able to handle it and grow because of it? It wasn't easy. It's never easy to be chastened. It's never enjoyable, but it's helpful. I know people right here in this congregation who have suffered, and I have seen them have a good, beautiful attitude and spirit. They had a good attitude about suffering. You never heard them complaining to God about their lot in life. Haven't heard them saying, I'm going to give up my faith in God. I'm going to give up serving God because He allowed me to suffer like this. Haven't seen that. Haven't heard anything like that. And people like that make me want to develop that same kind of spirit and attitude. I have talked to some in this congregation who have had that beautiful spirit and attitude. And I've expressed the fact that I wish I had their attitude, their spirit. It would be good for all of us if we had that good spirit and attitude and not give up our faith in God because some problem comes. And so there are values in suffering. And if we will have the right attitude toward the suffering, we can grow from it. We can overcome it here on earth. Suffering can help us learn patience. In James 1, verses 3 and 4, you remember that James said, "My brethren, count it all joy when ye fall into divers temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience." You see, sometimes when we're tried, it can strengthen us. It can work patience. It can produce good things in us. Suffering can draw the impenitent to God. Have you seen people who were suffering who decided that they ought to serve God? I've seen people like that in my time and in my work. You all remember the story of the prodigal son, the favorite parable of most people. Let me ask you, where was the prodigal son when he came to himself and decided to go back home? He was down in the pig pen. He was starving, hungry. When a person gets down in the hog pen and he's suffering, oftentimes it causes him to realize he needs God. Sometimes it leads the person to repent. There's no way you can make the hog pen a desirable place to live. I was preaching in a meeting over in Ellijay, Georgia, some years ago. Now that's Josh's hometown and home congregation. He was probably a little fellow when I was there in the meeting, but he'd probably know who I'm talking about. There was a man there who was a pig farmer. He raised pigs, not corn. And he asked me to come out and visit his hog pen. Now, I've seen hog pens all of my life. And when I envision a hog pen, I think of hogs being out there walling around in mud and filth and slop and some other nasty things. And they like that. And it's a smelly place. But when I went out to visit that man's hog pen, I didn't see any mud. Those hogs were living on concrete. They had poured a slab and built pens on top of it, and they were living on concrete. It still wasn't a very pleasant place to be. The man asked me what I thought about it, and I said, "This place is odoriferous." But he sniffed and said, "It smells like money to me." Depends upon one's perspective. But there's no way you can dress up a hog pen to be a pleasant place to be. And it's good sometimes for people to go down to the hog pen. It was good for the prodigal son. And it'd be good for some people today if they would get down to the hog pen when they'd be in need, hungry, and in the midst of all that filth. It might help them to turn back to God. Suffering sometimes is good for us. If we are living in sin and we go down to the hog pen, we might come to ourselves and turn back to God. On the other hand, affluence and comfort often cause people to think they don't need God. You know, if they are doing well, prospering, and are in good health, they may think they don't need God and they don't serve God. I remember reading something that Ted Turner said. You remember Ted Turner, the billionaire from Atlanta, the man who had everything a man could want materially? He was married to what some think was a beautiful woman, an actress, Jane Fonda, though I would not consider that a blessing personally. But he had everything materially that a person could want. But he wasn't concerned about God or religion. I remember that he said, religion is for weak people. It's for weak people. And because he was prospering materially, he didn't see any need for God. You know, suffering can be good for us. Being in poverty can be good for us. Being unhealthy can be good for us. If we're not serving God, that can serve as discipline to point us in the right direction. It's when we are hurting that we feel a need for God. You remember that passage again in Hebrews 12, beginning with verse 6, where Paul, if he be the writer, said, "For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth." God sometimes may use suffering to discipline us and point us in the right direction. In Psalm 119, verse 71, the psalmist said, "It is good for me that I have been afflicted, that I might learn thy statutes." The psalmist suffered. He was afflicted. And that affliction caused him to think about God and to learn God's will. Suffering sometimes can be good for us. It can point us in the direction of God. Suffering is a reminder of God's presence and God's love. If we think about all that's involved in it, we can begin to look for God's hand when we're suffering. I don't know if you remember Jane McWhirter or not. Probably many of you do. Likely many of you ladies have studied from her books in ladies' Bible classes. I had never met them personally until a few years ago. I was speaking on the lecture program, the Amarillo lectures, when it was being held in the Embassy Suites downtown. And after I spoke that time, one of the times I spoke on the program, afterwards I went back to have a seat back in the back, and there was a little break. And someone handed me a note and said, "Someone wanted me to give this to you." And I opened it, and it was not signed. But it said, "Your lesson is the best I've heard." It probably was the only lesson he heard that day, so he could say it was the best I've heard. But it didn't sign it. But I wanted to know who wrote that because it pumped me up and encouraged me. And I found out that it was written by Don McWhirter. Don and Jane were on the program also, and he was the one who wrote it. He was an encourager of preachers. Don McWhirter was a great preacher in his own right. A good man, faithful preacher. His wife was Jane McWhirter. She probably was as well known as he was. Years ago, Don preached in Gadsden, Alabama. Then he moved to Chattanooga, Tennessee, Greens Lake Road in Chattanooga. And then the mother of a dear friend back in Gadsden died, and they called upon Brother Don to come down and preach the funeral. So he and his family were driving down to Gadsden, and a woman who had no driver's license and no license to drive, had no insurance, and she was speeding. She crossed over into his lane and hit him head on. 2 members of his family almost died. Jane, his wife, was critically injured. The doctor said her head was cracked in over 200 places. I can't imagine it. But how do you take the shell off an egg when you boil it? You take it and beat it around on the bar and break the shell all up. Imagine, that's the way her head was shattered. Over 200 places it was cracked. I don't know how they even counted them. For 5 weeks or so, her life hovered between life and death. After about 5 weeks, she began to improve. But then there was a year at least of recuperation, a number of surgeries. During that time, she couldn't get up and do anything. She sat in a chair and read her Bible, studied, and prayed. She learned a great deal. She grew closer to God. And after over a year, she went back to her work. And because of that studying, learning, and prayer, she wrote a number of books. I have a number of them in my library. I'm sure David does too, and Steve as well. Great books, helpful books. She became a great speaker at ladies' day events and that type of thing. She learned and grew from that experience. I believe it is an illustration of the fact that we can suffer and overcome that suffering, and we can grow spiritually, and we can do great things. Our time is up. We'll stop right there, and we'll pick up there the next time. Come back and